At 9:27 a.m. on December 13, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair poled his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk into a climbing turn over the dense jungles of Assam, India. The morning sun glinted off the olive-drab fuselage of his fighter, nicknamed Lulu Belle and marked with the bold number 44. Below him lay Dinjan Airfield, a vital hub for the perilous Hump airlift operation supplying Chinese forces. For the 23-year-old pilot from the 89th Fighter Squadron, this was supposed to be a routine patrol, his 44th combat mission. But as he scanned the horizon, his blood ran cold. Materializing through the morning haze, 3 miles to the east was a dark swarm of aircraft, 64 Japanese warplanes flying in a disciplined formation, heading straight for his undefended base. He was the only Allied pilot airborne. The chatter on the radio confirmed it. The squadron was scrambled, but they were 38 minutes away. On the ground at Dinjan sat 14 fully loaded C-47 transports, a field hospital with 63 wounded, and fuel stocks critical for weeks of operations. The math was brutal. 1 P-40 against 24 bombers and 40 escorting fighters. Standard doctrine screamed for him to shadow and wait. Every instinct of self-preservation agreed. But as he watched the orderly V formations of Mitsubishi Sally bombers draw closer, he knew waiting meant condemning the base to destruction. With a silent curse and a steady hand, Adair pushed the throttle of his Allison engine forward, turning his fighter into the sun. He would not wait. He would attack. The Warhawk accelerated, its roar drowning out the thunder of his own heartbeat. His plan was a desperate longshot: use the sun as a blind, dive from high altitude onto the lead bomber formation, and shatter their cohesion before the escorting Nakajima Oscar fighters could react. His 6.50 caliber machine guns carried only about 12 seconds of total firing time. Surprise was his sole ally. As he rolled inverted and pointed the nose of Lulu Belle earthward, the world compressed into a tunnel of wind noise, gauges, and the approaching specks of enemy aircraft. He ignored the layered screen of agile Oscars above and below the bombers. His target was the brain of the raid, the lead Sallies. At 800 yards, still unseen, he opened fire. Tracers lanced through the sky, walking up the wing of the lead bomber. Metal sparked, fabric tore, and the port engine erupted in a gout of orange flame and black smoke. The tight V formation disintegrated into chaos as bombers scattered wildly. But as Adair pulled out of his screaming dive, crushing G-forces pressing him into his seat, his momentary triumph vanished. Reflected in his rearview mirror, the entire sky seemed to move. Not just a few, but dozens of silver dots were banking hard, turning their razor-thin wings toward him. The Oscar pack had seen him. Their reaction was terrifyingly fast. Now the real fight began, a duel where his heavier, faster P-40 was outnumbered 40-1 by the most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific. And as he leveled his wings, a new, chilling warning light flickered on his instrument panel. His engine, strained from the prolonged full-power climb and dive, was already beginning to overheat. Trapped in a sky seething with enemy fighters, Adair's mind clicked into a cold, calculated rhythm. The Oscars swarmed around him, but he clung to his Warhawk's one true advantage: raw, diving speed. He shoved the throttle to the firewall, the Allison engine shrieking in protest as he nosed over into a near-vertical dive. The Oscars, nimble but slower in a straight line, tried to follow but began to fall behind. Wind screamed through the bullet holes already peppering his fuselage. He wasn't running, he was resetting the fight. Pulling out at a terrifying speed, he glimpsed the bomber formation below, desperately trying to reform their offensive V-shape. They were the key. Ignoring the diving fighters behind him, he racked the P-40 into a high G turn and lined up for another slashing attack. This time he came from the side, his guns blazing at the exposed flank of a Sally. Tracers stitched across its wings and fuselage. With no armor or self-sealing tanks, the obsolete bomber was horrifically vulnerable. A fuel tank ignited, and the aircraft became a meteor of fire and metal, spiraling toward the emerald canopy below. The bombers scattered again, their disciplined approach cheddi-wache. But each pass cost him. His ammunition counter dwindled alarmingly, and the persistent Oscars, learning his tactics, began to anticipate his dive and zoom maneuvers, forcing him into tighter, more dangerous turns that bled his precious speed. Pulling up from his second kill, a hammerbolt jolted the aircraft. A lucky 7.7mm burst from a diving Oscar had finally found its mark. A line of holes erupted across his right wing, and more critically, a geyser of steaming green coolant erupted from the engine cowling, spraying across his windscreen. The cockpit instantly filled with the sickly sweet smell of ethylene glycol. His eyes shot to the temperature gauge. The needle was pinned deep into the red, far beyond the 250-degree F danger mark. This was a death sentence for the liquid-cooled Allison. The engine, already strained beyond limits, began to shudder and lose power. Black oil now mixed with the coolant, smearing his view. The Oscar that hit him swept past, a blur of rising sun insignia. Adair's mission had just catastrophically changed. He was no longer a hunter disrupting a raid. He was a crippled bird 40 miles inside hostile airspace, with a dying engine and a swarm of enemies who knew it. The Japanese fighters, sensing the kill, tightened their circle. Yet Dinjan Airfield was still unharmed. The bombers, though scattered, were still in the area, and some were beginning to turn back toward their target. Adair faced a grim calculus: glide toward possible safety and condemn the base, or use his last moments of power to make one final, desperate pass to break the raid for good. With a dying engine spewing coolant and a swarm of Nakajima K-43 Oscars closing in, Philip Adair's world narrowed to a violent calculus of angles and energy. The lightweight Japanese fighters, adorned with their distinctive red Hinamaru, could outturn his Warhawk with ease, their butterfly combat flaps allowing them to pivot in the sky with terrifying agility. Adair knew he could never win a turning fight. His only hope was to use his P-40's remaining strength, its sturdy construction and superior diving speed, in a series of slashing hit-and-run attacks. As two Oscars darted in from his 10 o'clock, he did the opposite of what they expected. He dove straight at them, his damaged engine howling. The Japanese pilots, surprised by the head-on aggression, scattered. Adair blew through the gap, his guns silent, conserving his precious few remaining rounds. His target remained the scattered sallies. One group was stubbornly reforming. Ignoring the Oscars now repositioning above him, he rolled into a shallow dive, building enough speed to make another pass on the bombers. The maneuver left him dangerously vulnerable, but it was the only way to keep the pressure on. As he lined up on a lone sally, tracers from an Oscar high above ripped past his canopy. They had his range. The battle was no longer about shooting him down immediately. It was about hurting him, exhausting him, and letting his own crippled aircraft finish the job. A sudden, violent shudder rocked the P-40. A second, more accurate burst from an Oscar had found its mark. The sound of tearing metal was drowned by a new, horrifying whistle, superheated steam erupting from the shattered coolant system. His oil pressure gauge plummeted toward zero. The Allison engine, running on friction and will, began to seize, its roar diminishing to a ragged metallic cough. Power faded instantly. He was now a glider in a sky of hawks. The Oscars, sensing the final act, circled with predatory patience. One bold pilot slid his aircraft alongside, so close Adair could see the man's goggles and white scarf. The Japanese pilot emphatically pointed downward toward the jungle, gesturing for him to land and surrender. In that moment, the choice seemed stark: a POW camp or a fiery crash. But as he looked past his adversary, he saw the disorganized bomber formations still milling in confusion, their attack run shattered. He had done it. The mission was accomplished, even if he wouldn't return. A strange calm washed over him. He ignored the gesturing pilot, focused instead on the smoky horizon where his base lay.
he was not done flying yet. With a defiant shake of his head, he shoved the mixture control to its emergency setting, feigning a final aggressive lunge. The Oscar pilot peeled away, and Adair, with no power left, lowered the P-40's nose to maintain glide speed, beginning his long, silent descent toward the sea of green, every enemy fighter watching him fall.
The Allison V-1710 engine was a masterpiece of engineering, but now it was a dying heart of molten metal. With the coolant system shredded, the temperature gauge useless, and his oil pressure gone, Philip Adair flew by feel alone. A terrible vibration shook the entire airframe, each revolution of the seized bearings sending jarring tremors through the controls. The Japanese Oscars, still circling like vultures, held their fire, believing the kill was inevitable. Adair's mind raced through the emergency procedures, all of them ending with abandoned aircraft. But the jungle below was a green hell of Japanese patrols and malaria. He had to keep the plane flying. Suddenly, a new threat emerged. One Oscar, piloted by a particularly aggressive adversary, broke from the circle and positioned itself directly in front of his gliding path. The Japanese pilot was performing a dangerous slow-speed maneuver, forcing a head-on pass. It was a duelist's challenge. With minimal power, Adair had little control. As the two aircraft converged at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour, the Oscar's nose sparkled with the muzzle flashes of its 2.12-millimeter synchronized machine guns. Adair, his own ammunition spent, could only duck behind the engine block and hold his course. A storm of heavy-caliber rounds tore into the Warhawk. The sound was apocalyptic, a cacophony of shattering glass, tearing metal, and hissing hydraulic lines. A searing pain exploded in Adair's left shoulder as a shell fragment ripped through the cockpit's side armor and embedded itself in his flesh. The canopy above his head starred and splintered from another hit. Worse, a heavy blow struck the instrument panel, sending a shower of sparks and short-circuiting the remaining electrical systems. Smoke, acrid and thick, filled the cockpit from smoldering wiring. For a moment, he was blinded, choking, the aircraft beginning to tumble from his loss of control. This was the end. Yet, through the pain and smoke, his training screamed at him. He kicked the right rudder pedal hard, fighting the spin. The P-40, remarkably resilient, responded sluggishly. The Oscar shot past, its pilot likely believing his kill was confirmed. As the smoke cleared slightly, Adair assessed the new reality. He was wounded, his cockpit was a shambles, and the controls felt heavy and unresponsive. The stick refused to move forward, the damaged elevator cables locking it in place. He was stuck in a slow descending turn, unable to level out. But in that moment of utter hopelessness, a wild, theoretical idea from a forgotten training lecture flashed in his mind. If the controls were jammed to put you into a death spiral, what would happen if you flipped the entire world upside down? Defying gravity and reason, Philip Adair rolled the dying Warhawk onto its back. The world inverted. Jungle became sky, and the hazy blue firmament turned to a sea of green. The negative G-forces slammed him against his shoulder straps, and blood rushed to his head with a pounding pressure. But the jammed controls, which had been pulling the plane into a death spiral, now worked in reverse. The stuck elevator, forcing the nose down in normal flight, now lifted it. The shot-up aileron, dragging the right wing earthward, now corrected the roll. Against all odds, the crippled P-40 stabilized, flying inverted in a slow, grotesque climb. The circling Oscars, witnessing this impossible spectacle, were momentarily stunned. To them, it looked like a final, chaotic death throes of a doomed aircraft. Yet the Warhawk kept flying, a smoking, inverted phantom clawing for every foot of altitude. Adair thought the disorientation, focusing on the horizon line that was now beneath his head. The engine, starved of proper oil circulation and cooled only by the slipstream, gave one last sputtering cough and fell completely silent. The propeller windmilled to a stop. He was now flying a glider upside down, a feat considered aerodynamically suicidal. But it was working. He was maintaining controlled flight, navigating this impossible state toward a sliver of hope on the southwestern horizon, his base at Naguli. However, the inverted glide was a temporary, fragile solution. The aircraft's fuel and oil systems were not designed for sustained negative Gs. After a minute, the engine, starved of fuel, threatened to quit entirely, and the strain on the damaged airframe was immense. Adair had to invent a new, rhythmic form of flight. He would fly inverted until the plane began to shudder from fuel starvation, then, with a gut-wrenching roll, bring it back upright. In normal attitude, the damaged controls would immediately force the nose down into a dive. He would let it dive for a few hundred feet to regain vital airspeed and let fuel flow to the engine. Then, before crashing into the jungle, he would roll inverted again, using the reversed controls to pull out and climb. This insane ballet, flip, climb, roll, dive, flip, climb, roll, continued for 11 agonizing minutes. Each maneuver was a gamble with the structural integrity of the bullet-riddled airframe. The Oscars, having seen enough, finally broke off and headed for home, leaving the seemingly doomed American to his fate. Alone in the silent, smoky cockpit, his vision tunneling from pain and carbon monoxide, Adair focused on a single point, the distant, shimmering rectangle of Naguli's runway. He had overcome an armada. He had defied physics. Now he faced the final brutal test, landing a silent, uncontrollable wreck with no engine and no second chances. The distant runway at Naguli grew from a shimmering mirage into a defined strip of pierced steel planking, a beacon of salvation that now presented an insurmountable new problem. To land, Philip Adair needed his landing gear down. But the P-40's gear was hydraulically actuated, and with the engine dead, the primary pump was useless. His only hope was a manual backup, a small handle-driven hydraulic pump on the cockpit's left side. With his right arm throbbing from his wound and his vision swimming, he had to fly the wildly unstable aircraft and pump the gear down simultaneously. Using a makeshift strap to lash the control stick in a semi-neutral position, he released his harness and threw his weight into the manual pump. Each stroke was an agony, a fight against fluid pressure and failing strength. After 28 excruciating pumps, a heavy thunk resonated through the airframe, the left gear locking down. Seconds later, the right followed. But the drag was immense. His glide angle steepened alarmingly. The runway was still 2 miles away, and he was sinking fast. Below, the ground crew at Naguli had spotted the strange, silent approach of the smoking Warhawk. To them, it was a surreal vision, an aircraft trailing smoke, flying erratically, with its landing gear down while still far from the field. Confusion turned to alarm as they realized the pilot was not making a normal approach, but a desperate, unpowered glide from an awkward altitude. They scrambled, fire trucks roaring to life, unaware that the pilot fighting for his life was the same man who had just single-handedly turned back an entire Japanese raid. As the jungle treetops rushed perilously close beneath his wings, Adair made a brutal calculation. He wouldn't make the runway threshold in a normal nose-up glide. The numbers didn't add up. Then he recalled an offhand remark from an old instructor about extreme aerodynamics. An aircraft's glide ratio could sometimes be improved in an inverted attitude due to reduced drag from the wing's shape. It was a theoretical footnote, never meant for a real-world gear-down landing attempt. With no options left, he committed to the ultimate gamble. A few hundred feet above the trees, and still a mile from the runway, he rolled the P-40 onto its back once more. To the horrified ground crew, it looked like a final, catastrophic loss of control. The aircraft, now completely inverted with its landing gear pointed at the sky, seemed destined to slam into the jungle. But Adair felt it immediately. The sink rate decreased.
The inverted glide was buying him precious yards. He held the terrifying posture, the world a disorienting upside-down blur, blood pounding in his temples as the concrete strip slid into his inverted field of view. At the last possible second, with the runway threshold flashing beneath him, he rolled the heavy aircraft upright. The impact was violent and immediate. The P-40, devoid of all energy, dropped on the steel matting like a stone.
The impact was a deafening, metallic scream. The P-40 struck the pierced steel planking of Nguli's runway with the force of a bomb, its compromised right landing gear collapsing instantly. The aircraft slewed violently to the right, the wingtip digging into the ground, sending a shower of sparks and torn metal cartwheeling through the air. Fuel from ruptured lines sprayed across the hot engine, igniting into a trail of fire as the Warhawk ground-looped through a sickening 180-degree turn. Inside the cockpit, Philip Adair was thrown against his straps like a rag doll, his world reduced to a deafening cacophony of rending aluminum, shattering glass, and the screech of metal on steel. The aircraft skidded backward for what felt like an eternity before finally lurching to a stop, tilted on its broken right side, flames licking hungrily at the cowling from the spilled fuel. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the crackle of fire and the hiss of escaping steam. Ground crews and fire teams sprinted toward the wreck, expecting the worst. Then, against all odds, the battered canopy slid back. Choking on smoke and blood, his left arm hanging useless, Adair hauled himself out onto the bullet-riddled wing and collapsed into the arms of a stunned sergeant. On the ground, the full extent of the sacrifice became clear. Lulu Belle was a total wreck. The once proud Warhawk's fuselage was a sieve of over 30 bullet holes. The right wing spar was cracked, the tail section twisted, and the engine was a seized, smoldering mass of metal, its pistons welded to the crankshaft from heat and oil starvation. The ingenious, inverted flight had stressed the airframe beyond its limits, and the final crash landing had finished the job. As medics attended to Adair's shoulder wound and carbon monoxide poisoning, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez conducted a somber walk-around. He noted the severed aileron cables, the punctured hydraulic reservoir, and the shattered instrument panel. The aircraft had not just been damaged, it had been systematically dismantled by enemy fire and sheer mechanical abuse. Yet, as the fire was extinguished and the smoke cleared, a profound realization settled over the men. This mangled heap of aluminum had done its job and then some. It had brought its pilot home against impossible odds. Adair, pale but conscious, looked at the remains of his fighter. There was no sentimentality, only the cold assessment of a combat pilot. The plane was gone, but the airfield at Dinjan, with its transports, fuel, and wounded, stood untouched. The machine had paid the ultimate price to complete the mission. The after-action reports confirmed the impossible. Reconnaissance flights and signal intercepts revealed that all 24 Japanese bombers had jettisoned their ordnance harmlessly over the jungle and fled back to Burma, their mission chertily chappied. Not a single bomb had fallen on Dinjan. 14 C-47s stood ready to resume the hump airlift. The hospital was intact and the fuel dump secure. Philip Adair's lone stand had not just saved an airfield, it had preserved a critical logistical artery for the entire China-Burma-India theater. When debriefed by 10th Air Force intelligence officers, his calm, technical description of inverted flight with jammed controls was initially met with disbelief. However, the evidence was irrefutable. The wreck of Lulu Belle, the carbon monoxide levels in his blood still dangerously high 72 hours later, and the confirmed dispersal of the enemy formation. His actions defied every tactical manual. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell himself presented a pale and still recovering Adair with the Silver Star for gallantry. The citation barely captured the sheer audacity of the deed. By his superb airmanship, aggressive fighting spirit, and complete disregard for personal safety, he disrupted the enemy formation and forced its withdrawal, thereby preventing severe damage to vital installations. The legend of the pilot who fought upside down began to spread through the weary hump crews, a desperately needed tale of hope and indomitable will. Philip Adair returned to combat within months, flying 95 more missions with the 89th Fighter Squadron, the Burma Banshees. He became an ace, eventually credited with 5 confirmed victories, including 2 more Ki-43 Oscars. He survived the war, serving a full 30-year career in the U.S. Air Force and retiring as a colonel in 1971. The P-40 Warhawk, often overshadowed by more famous fighters, never shed its reputation as a tough, forgiving workhorse, a quality that allowed Adair to perform his miracle. The 89th Squadron, with its iconic skull and wings insignia, would destroy over 400 Japanese aircraft before war's end. But the story of December 13, 1943, transcends statistics. It is a timeless testament to a principle no machine specification sheet can quantify: that in the crucible of combat, the human element, the courage, ingenuity, and refusal to yield of a single individual can alter the course of events against all material odds. Adair's solution, born of desperation and profound understanding of his aircraft, remains a unique footnote in aviation history. His inverted landing approach was never replicated, not because it was impossible, but because it demanded a perfect storm of damage, skill, and sheer nerve that the war, thankfully, never required again. The legacy of his feat is a permanent reminder that valor is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important.